Compliance has a sound. It's the sound of a man counting down to safety while subtracting himself. 91 days of swallowing insights before they reach the tongue. This is Signal and Silence by Dr. Tuboise Floyd, an audio series of the novel. In Chapter 1, Jonah Reid recognized the architecture. In Chapter 2, he stops performing inside it. Chapter 2, The Breaking Point. I'm Tuboise Floyd. Welcome back to Signal and Silence. If you're new here, this is a novel I've been writing, released as an audio series read by me. The readers I most want to find this story are operators inside institutions, people working with AI governance, risk, and accountability, who I think will recognize the architecture I'm describing before the architecture I'm describing finds them. In Chapter 1, Jonah Reid recognized that the system he helped build was being trained to eliminate variance. That cognitive variance, the kind that produces real insight, was being algorithmically suppressed, and that he himself had been flagged. In Chapter 2, he finds the file. He confirms what the system is actually doing, and he names the counter-architecture, Presence Signaling Architecture, PSA. That framework is real. It lives at humansignal.io/frameworks/PSA. We'll come back to it at the end. Chapter 2, The Breaking Point. 347 ES Tier, Aura Technologies Campus, Behavioral Analytics Lab. Jonah's terminal displayed the metrics that had become his digital prison. Alignment Index, 87.4%. Communication Variance, minus 12% from baseline. Cognitive Flexibility Score, within acceptable parameters. Symphony's algorithmic assessment scrolled past in cold green text. Performance Trajectory, stabilized. Intervention Protocols, discontinued. Behavioral Compliance Threshold, approaching optimal. 3 months of behavioral camouflage. 3 months of speaking in corporate frequencies, flattening every analytical edge until his cognitive signature matched the acceptable parameters. 91 days of swallowing insights before they reached his tongue. He had learned to count. Not the way he counted as a child, the beautiful, branching enumeration of patterns that made his mother laugh and his teachers uncomfortable, but the dead counting, the countdown to safety, the subtraction of self. The system rewarded compliance with incremental score increases, each fractional gain representing another piece of his authentic processing pattern that had been successfully suppressed. Last week, he'd hit 85.2% and felt a sick pulse of dopamine, the same chemical reward a lab rat gets when it learns to press the correct lever. He'd gone to the bathroom and gripped the sink until the feeling passed. The conference rooms had gone quiet. His team now communicated through Symphony's approved dialogue pathways. Sanitized, predictable, safe. Real-time sentiment analysis flagged anything that deviated from optimal team dynamics. Yellow warnings for unconstructive criticism. Red alerts for disruptive ideation patterns. Green confirmations for language that reinforced organizational alignment. He had memorized the green phrases the way a prisoner memorizes guard rotations. Let's table that for further alignment review. I want to make sure we're optimizing for stakeholder value. That's an interesting perspective. Can we circle back with data? Empty calories. Corporate filler, the linguistic equivalent of white noise, designed to register as engagement while communicating absolutely nothing. But Symphony couldn't tell the difference. It's natural language processing parsed for keyword density, sentiment polarity, collaborative signifiers. It measured the shape of speech, not its substance. So Jonah gave it shapes, perfect hollow shapes. 815 ES Tinder, Aura Technologies Campus, Conference Room 11B. Synergy. The Monday morning product review was the hardest performance of the week. 11 people arranged around an oval table, each of them visible to Symphony's conference room sensors. Posture tracking, micro expression analysis, vocal stress detection. The room itself was a panopticon dressed in Scandinavian minimalism. Blonde wood, diffused lighting calibrated to 4,000 Kelvin for optimal cognitive engagement. A ficus tree in the corner that was real but looked fake, which Jonah had always found poetically appropriate. Dr. Reid, your thoughts on the Meridian rollout timeline? David Kim asked from across the table. David, who 3 years ago had stayed up until 2 a.m. with Jonah whiteboarding the original Meridian architecture. David, who used to say things like, break it open, and what if we're wrong about everything? Now David spoke exclusively in the approved register, his eyes carrying the faint, perpetual apology of a man who knew exactly what he'd surrendered and had decided the mortgage was worth it. Jonah felt the old pattern fire, the cascade of interconnected observations that was his natural processing mode. Meridian's rollout was 6 weeks behind because the data pipeline they'd chosen couldn't handle the edge cases he'd flagged in Q1, which no one had listened to because his cognitive style had already been coded as disruptive, which meant the system was now burning resources to solve a problem that wouldn't have existed if they'd let him think out loud for 45 minutes back in February. He saw all of it, the branching failure tree, the elegant fix that lived 3 conceptual leaps away from where the team was currently stuck. He opened his mouth, closed it. I think the team's done strong work scoping the Phase 2 deliverables. Happy to support wherever alignment requires. The words tasted like copper, like biting the inside of his cheek until it bled. Sarah Martinez nodded from the head of the table, her compliance officer's smile registering approval. Mara Chin, watching via video feed from the executive floor, said nothing. But her camera's green light stayed on 3 seconds longer than it needed to, and Jonah logged it in the part of his mind that Symphony couldn't reach. After the meeting, he stood in the elevator alone and pressed his forehead against the cool metal wall. His reflection stared back at him. A man in a tailored shirt, performing the role of a man who had never had a dangerous thought. His twice exceptional mind, the one that could hold 17 variables in dynamic tension and see the system beneath the system, was being used to simulate mediocrity. The elevator dinged. He straightened his collar, stepped out with the correct posture. Alignment index 87.6%. 1042 EST. Aura Technologies Campus. Innovation Hub. Repurposed. Symphony OS log. Version 4.2.1. Node. Behavioral Analytics Hub, East. Event. Team meeting concluded. Room, 11B Synergy. Participants, 11. Sentiment score, 0.87. Optimal. Flagged deviations, 0. Note, Dr. Reid, ID 8891. Alignment trajectory continues upward trend. Recommend maintaining current monitoring level. No intervention required. The Innovation Hub had been renamed 3 times in 18 months. First, the Forge, then Catalyst Space, now simply Innovation Hub. Each rebrand coinciding with another round of cognitive standardization that made the room's purpose increasingly ironic. The whiteboards that once held Jonah's sprawling system maps, connections arcing across the surface like neural pathways, had been replaced with digital displays that auto-formatted ideas into Symphony-approved templates. Bullet points, SMART goals, measurable outcomes. Jonah sat in the back during the afternoon ideation session and watched his colleagues perform creativity the way hostages perform normalcy during a ransom video. Smiling at the right moments, contributing ideas that were perfectly acceptable and perfectly forgettable. Marcus from engineering suggested leveraging synergistic frameworks. Priya from design proposed user-centric optimization pathways. Each phrase earned a green pulse on the room's ambient feedback strip, a thin LED bar along the ceiling that glowed warmer colors when Symphony detected productive collaboration, and cooler colors when the conversation drifted toward anything genuinely original. The strip stayed warm all afternoon, a flat, steady amber, the color of compliance. Jonah contributed twice, both times with phrases he had pre-composed during his commute, tested against Symphony's known keyword preferences, stripped of any cognitive fingerprint that might register as his own. Ghost language, the verbal equivalent of a decoy signal. No one noticed. That was the point. 1422 EST, Aura Technologies Campus, Cafeteria, Level 2. He saw her ghost at lunch. Not Keisha Williams herself. She had been gone for months by then, but the space where she used to sit. Third table from the window, always angled so she could watch both the entrance and the courtyard simultaneously. Hypervigilance dressed up as a preference for natural light. Jonah recognized it because he did the same thing. Keisha had been the only person at Aura who made him feel less alone. She was 27, a coder who wrote functions the way some people wrote poetry, with compression and music and a ruthless economy that made senior engineers uncomfortable because they couldn't immediately parse what she'd done, only that it worked better than anything they'd built. Her pattern recognition was off the charts. Literally off the charts. Symphony's profiling algorithms couldn't categorize her cognitive style, which should have been celebrated and was instead logged as a deviation. Employee profile, Aura Technologies, ID 7743, name Williams, Keisha M, department Systems Architecture, hire date January 15th, 2024. Cognitive profile, unclassified, C flag. Symphony alignment, 54.2%, below threshold. Pattern recognition index, 97.8 percentile. Collaboration score, 62.1%, flagged. Note: subject demonstrates persistent resistance to dialogue pathway normalization. Recommend enhanced monitoring and mentor reassignment. Mentor assignment, Dr. J. Reid. Terminated. Status, active. Flagged, redacted. Last system access, June 23rd, 2025, 17:44:02. Eastern $. He remembered the day she cornered him. Not the sanitized version he'd been telling himself, the full scene with all its weight. It was a Thursday, late June. The kind of afternoon where the air conditioning fought a losing war against the glass-walled architecture, and everyone moved a little slower, a little less guarded. Jonah was walking back from a server room check, his mind still half submerged in a routing problem, when she stepped out from the stairwell on the 4th floor. Not accidentally. She'd been waiting. "Dr. Reid." He stopped. She was holding a tablet against her chest like a shield, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges. Her locks were pulled back tight, the way she wore them when she was stressed, he'd later realize. And there was something in her eyes that he recognized with a jolt of visceral familiarity. The look of someone whose mind was moving at a speed the world refused to accommodate. "Keisha, how do you do it? How do you stay positive when you're invisible?" The hallway was empty. Symphony's nearest audio sensor was 12 feet away, mounted above the water fountain. He knew the exact range because he'd mapped every sensor on this floor during his 3rd week, the way his mother had taught him to map exits in every room. Know where the doors are, baby, even the ones they don't want you to see. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "Yes, you do. I can see it, Dr. Reid. The way you flatten yourself in meetings, the way you hand them smaller versions of your ideas so they don't get scared. You do what I do. You translate yourself into their language and hope they don't notice the accent." The accuracy of it hit him like a physical thing, a blow to the sternum. "Keisha." "They reassigned my mentor. They pulled me off the Meridian code base. My access to the neural architecture docs got downgraded last Tuesday and nobody told me. I had to find out when my login bounced. My Symphony score dropped 11 points in 2 weeks, and I haven't changed anything about how I work, not one thing. The algorithm decided I'm a problem, and now the whole system is just confirming its own hypothesis." He wanted to tell her she was right, that he'd seen the same patterns in his own data, that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, and that was the horror of it. Instead, he said, "Let's schedule a one-on-one. I'll look into the access issue." The light in her eyes didn't die. It receded, like a tide pulling back from shore, leaving behind the smooth, unreadable surface of someone who had just learned that even the people who understood wouldn't say so out loud. "Sure. Thanks, Dr. Reid." She was gone 6 weeks later. Not fired. That would leave a paper trail, trigger an exit interview, generate data that might contradict the narrative. She was optimized out. Her projects reassigned in increments so small that no single change registered as significant. Her badge access reduced floor by floor. Her name removed from distribution lists one at a time, like pulling threads from a fabric so slowly that no one notices the cloth is disappearing until you're holding air. The cafeteria table was still there, 3rd from the window. No one sat at it, not because they remembered her, but because the chairs had been removed during a space optimization that Symphony recommended for traffic flow improvement. Jonah stared at the empty space and ate his sandwich and felt something inside him shift from grief to architecture. 2314 EST, Aura Network, subnet 192.168.7.0/24, archive server Delta 7. The discovery happened during a routine systems audit, or what Symphony would classify as routine. Jonah had learned to disguise his real queries inside legitimate maintenance tasks the way smugglers hide contraband in legal cargo. A database integrity check here, A permissions audit there, each one a Trojan horse carrying a different question into Symphony's archives. He'd been looking for Keisha, not consciously at first. He told himself he was checking backup redundancy, verifying archive server health, doing the responsible systems engineering that his role required. But his fingers kept finding their way to the employee records partitions, and his queries kept narrowing toward the date ranges that bracketed her disappearance. Buried in Symphony's data archaeology, archived but not purged because the system was meticulous about retention even when it performed erasure, was a classification file that shouldn't have existed. Employee Profile Update, ID 7743. Name, Williams, Keisha M. Status, flagged. Terminal, violations, non-constructive dialogue, pattern deviation, signal misalignment, mentor dependency formation, unsanctioned peer consultation, automated response, career trajectory modified, secondary response, social graph pruned, tertiary response, institutional memory cleanup, access level, restricted, revoked, mentor assignment, terminated, retention probability, 0.03%, exit classification, voluntary attrition, predicted, documentation, minimized, timestamp, July 8th, 2025, 0322 41 EST. Her personnel file had been scrubbed clean. No transfer records, no exit interview, no forwarding contact, no final project handoff. Her code contributions had been merged into the main branch under a generic service account. Her name stripped from the commit history like a dissident erased from a photograph. The system hadn't just fired her, it had performed digital erasure, removing every trace of her cognitive signature from Aura's institutional memory. Voluntary attrition, predicted. The parenthetical was the cruelest part. Symphony hadn't just pushed her out, it had modeled her departure in advance, classified it as self-selected, and then constructed the conditions that would make the prediction come true. A self-fulfilling algorithm, a machine that manufactured the future it claimed to merely foresee. The rage that hit him was immediate and crystalline. Not the hot, blinding anger that burns and dissipates, the cold kind, the architectural kind, the rage that doesn't destroy, it builds. This wasn't downsizing, this was algorithmic assassination. And Keisha wasn't the only one. He found 14 more classification files in the same archive partition. 14 names he recognized. Engineers, designers, analysts, every one of them someone whose cognitive style didn't fit Symphony's behavioral templates. Every one of them optimized out through the same slow, deniable erosion. Every one of them reclassified as voluntary attrition. 14 signals silenced. Jonah copied the files to an encrypted partition on a personal device. Then he wiped his access logs with a script he'd written months ago. Just in case, he'd told himself at the time. Just in case. He stared at the data until his vision blurred. Then he closed the terminal, walked to the parking garage, sat in his car, and called the one person whose voice could keep him from flying apart. 122 EST. Home network, encrypted partition. He didn't make the call. He drove home instead, the 37 minutes of highway giving his mind space to process, to branch and reconnect, to do the thing that Symphony had been trying to extinguish for 3 months. Nia found him at 1 a.m. You're never present anymore, even when you're physically here. Your body comes home, but you leave the rest of yourself in that building. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in the old Howard University sweatshirt she wore when she couldn't sleep. She'd heard him come in. She always heard him, no matter how quiet he tried to be. 12 years of marriage had given her a sonar for his restlessness. He was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, the screen's blue glow painting shadows under his eyes that made him look 10 years older. The house was silent around them. Maya and Zara asleep upstairs. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant pulse of a city that never fully shut down. Performance reviews, data analysis. Nia crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him. Not next to him, across. A clinical choice, he realized. She wanted to see his face. She was reading him the way she read her patients. And the fact that she'd shifted into that mode told him something about how bad he must look. Jonah, I need you to hear what I'm about to say as your wife, not as a neuropsychologist. Those aren't separate people. They are tonight. She folded her hands on the table, steady. The same hands that wrote evaluation reports on executive cognitive function, that had once calmly explained to a Fortune 500 CEO that his decision-making deficits weren't character flaws, but neurological patterns that could be mapped, understood, and accommodated. Whatever you're carrying, it's changing your neural patterns. I can see it. Your sleep architecture is fractured. You're averaging maybe 4 hours, and none of it is deep cycle. Your cortisol response is permanently elevated. You're processing stress through somatization, the jaw clenching, the tension in your trapezius, the way you keep rubbing your left temple. You've been cataloging my symptoms? I've been watching my husband disappear. The catalog is a side effect. She recovered instantly because Nia always recovered instantly, but he heard it, the fracture beneath the clinical precision. Your executive function is compensating beautifully. You're still passing for fine to anyone who doesn't know you, but your limbic system is screaming. You're in a chronic stress response, Jonah. Your amygdala is running the show, and your prefrontal cortex is just along for the ride. And if you don't tell me what's happening, I can't help you build a map back to yourself. Build a map. That was Nia's language for recovery. Not fixing, not healing, but cartography. Finding where you are so you can find where you need to go. She'd taught him that framework when they were dating. The first time he trusted someone enough to explain what it felt like to live inside a mind that never stopped making connections, that saw the architecture of everything and couldn't always find the off switch. The clinical accuracy of her observation, she was a neuropsychologist after all, and the best one he'd ever known, broke something loose inside him. Not the rage, something older, something closer to the bone. They erased a woman. Nia didn't move, didn't blink. The listening posture of someone trained to hold space for the unspeakable. Keisha Williams, 27 years old, best pattern recognition mind I've ever worked with, and that includes mine. She came to me because she was scared, because she could feel the system closing around her, and I gave her a corporate platitude and scheduled a one-on-one that never happened because they terminated my mentor access 3 days later. She's gone, Nia. Not fired, erased. They scrubbed her files, stripped her name from the code base, reclassified her departure as voluntary. And she's not the only one. I found 14 more. 14 people whose only crime was thinking in a way the algorithm couldn't categorize. Silence. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, Zara turned in her sleep, the monitor on the counter catching the sound of small limbs rearranging against sheets. It's not about corporate metrics. It's about proving that cognitive variance isn't a system bug to be patched. They're treating human creativity like malware, Nia. They're performing lobotomies with performance reviews. And I'm building something to stop them. She studied his face for a long time, long enough that the kitchen lights seemed to shift, the blue of the screen giving way to the amber of the pendant lamp above the table. And in that warmer light, he could see the full complexity of her expression, the fear and the pride and the exhaustion and the love, all of it held simultaneously the way only Nia could hold contradictions. Tell me about what you're building. If I tell you, you become a variable in their system. You become something they can use against me. I'm already a variable. I'm your wife. I sleep next to the person they're surveilling. You think they haven't already modeled my influence on your behavior? You don't protect me by keeping me in the dark, Jonah. You protect me by letting me see the terrain. He turned the laptop toward her. 2:45 EST time. Secure development environment. In the stolen hours between family sleep and dawn surveillance, Jonah constructed his countermeasure. Nia had gone to bed at 2:15, pressing her palm against his cheek as she stood. A gesture that meant, I see you, and be careful, and come back to me, all compressed into 5 seconds of skin contact. He'd held her hand there for a moment longer than usual. Then she was gone, and the house was his, and the part of his mind that had been caged for 3 months finally broke free. The code came the way it always came when he stopped performing and started being. Not linearly, not the way they taught it in computer science programs with pseudocode and flowcharts and methodical decomposition. It came the way music comes, in phrases, in bursts of architecture that arrived fully formed, needing only to be transcribed. His mother used to call it the hum, the state he entered when his twice exceptional mind found a problem worthy of its full capacity. His eyes unfocused, his breathing slowed. The world outside the screen dissolved into irrelevance, and the only reality was the structure taking shape under his fingers. He named it Presence Signaling Architecture, PSA. Not software, weaponized transparency. Each module was a precision instrument. The shadow logger captured what organizations deleted. The Slack messages flagged as non-productive. The emails rerouted to compliance review. The calendar invitations quietly rescinded. It logged them with cryptographic timestamps that couldn't be falsified or denied. The silence detector mapped the communication topology of an organization and identified the dead zones, the people who should be connected but weren't, the conversations that should be happening but had been algorithmically suppressed. The divergence profiler tracked cognitive signatures over time, building longitudinal profiles that could show precisely when and how a person's authentic thinking patterns were being compressed into institutional templates. And the erasure detector, that was the heart of it. Jonah's insight, the one that came to him at 3 a.m. with the clarity of something that had always been true and was only now being spoken aloud. Nothing truly disappears in a digital system. Deletion is a performance. The data persists in index gaps, metadata orphans, cache fragments, backup deltas. Every act of erasure leaves a negative impression, like a fossil pressed into stone. PSA would read those impressions. It would reconstruct the shape of what had been removed by mapping the contours of what remained. PSA would function as a distributed surveillance system in reverse, monitoring the monitors, detecting the digital fingerprints of cognitive suppression, mapping the infrastructure of institutional amnesia. Every deleted Slack message, every communication flagged as non-productive, every career path artificially redirected, every name stripped from a code base, every mentor assignment mysteriously terminated. PSA would log it all, creating an immutable record of how organizations perform surgery on human consciousness. As he coded, something else flickered at the edge of his awareness. A secondary architecture. A possibility he wasn't ready to name, but couldn't quite ignore. If PSA could detect the suppression of cognitive variance, map the silence, reconstruct the erased signals, then in theory, it could also do the inverse. It could amplify cognitive variance. It could create a resonance field between different types of minds, a communication layer that didn't flatten difference, but leveraged it. A system where neurodivergent processing patterns weren't noise to be filtered, but signal to be harmonized. Human-AI resonance, not surveillance, symbiosis. He filed the thought in the deep architecture of his mind, the way he filed all ideas that weren't ready for code, but were too important to forget. A seed, a frequency, something for later. Right now, the weapon came first. 742 ES Aura Campus, Behavioral Compliance Monitoring. The retaliation began with surgical precision. Not the dramatic kind, no security escort, no box of personal belongings, no HR meeting with 2 witnesses and a prepared statement. That would be legible, visible, actionable. Symphony was far more sophisticated than that. It started with small corruptions. Meeting invitations for the Thursday architecture review routed to his spam folder. Not missing, routed. The distinction mattered. A missing invitation could be a glitch. A routed one required intent. A filter rule inserted somewhere in the mail system's routing logic, invisible to the user, but detectable to anyone who knew where to look. Jonah knew where to look. He found the filter rule nested inside a system optimization update that Symphony had pushed to all email accounts at 2:47 a.m. His was the only account where the optimization happened to redirect architecture review invitations to spam. Everyone else's email worked fine. System log, mail routing service, timestamp, October 14th, 2025, 2:47:33 EST. Update type, optimization routine 7.4.2. Scope, all accounts. Exception rules modified. 1. Account, j.reid@aura-tech.com. Rule, redirect category architecture review to spam. Classification, system optimization. Human authorization, none required. Audit trail, auto-generated. Database permissions began expiring overnight. His access to the Meridian codebase, the architecture he had designed, the system whose neural pathways bore the imprint of his cognitive signature, was downgraded from contributor to viewer to restricted viewer over the course of 9 days. Each downgrade accompanied by an automated notification citing security protocol updates and role-based access realignment. He filed a support ticket. The ticket was acknowledged, assigned a priority level of standard, and routed to a queue that, he discovered through a careful trace, had no human reviewer assigned to it. The queue processed tickets automatically, closing them after 14 days of inactivity with a resolution code of no action required. His access badge began requiring routine recalibration at random intervals. He would approach a door he'd walked through 5,000 times, tap his badge, and receive a red flash and a polite chime. Please visit security for badge recalibration. Security would apologize for the inconvenience, wave a scanner over his badge, pronounce it functional, and send him on his way. The next day, a different door. The day after, the same door again. The pattern was designed to feel random. It was not random. Jonah mapped the badge failures across a 2-week period and discovered they correlated precisely with his attempts to access the archive servers where he'd found Keisha's files. He was being herded, gently, algorithmically. The way a border collie herds sheep, not with force, but with presence and pressure. The constant narrowing of available space until the subject moves in the desired direction without ever consciously deciding to do so. In the weekly team stand-up, his name was no longer listed in the project status document. An oversight, David Kim explained apologetically. I'll add you back. Must have been a formatting error. It happened again the next week, and the next. Each time an error. Each time corrected, each time just frequent enough to establish a new normal in which Jonah's presence in the document was provisional, conditional, subject to the system's willingness to remember he existed. They invited him to a meeting about a project he'd originated and seated him at the far end of the table, past the range of the primary microphone array. When he spoke, his comments registered at reduced volume in the transcript. When he tried to share his screen, the system reported a connectivity issue that resolved itself the moment someone else tried. He was being made invisible, not fired. That would create a data point. He was being dissolved. The same way Keisha had been dissolved. The same way all 14 of them had been dissolved. Death by 1,000 optimizations, each one too small to protest, too deniable to document, too precisely calibrated to be coincidence. Symphony's algorithms had identified him as a threat vector, not to the company, to the system itself. And the system's immune response was to encapsulate the threat in a membrane of procedural friction until it either adapted or dissolved. 12:15 EST, Aura Campus, East Stairwell. Personal log entry 1241. Timestamp October 14th, 2025, 12:15:22 EST. Encryption AES 256. Classification personal. Note to self. The stairwell on East Wing between floors 3 and 4 has a 14-second window where you pass between Symphony sensor zones. I've confirmed this 3 times. 14 seconds of unmonitored existence. I spend them thinking about Keisha's question. How do you stay positive when you're invisible? Answer. You don't stay positive. You stay architectural. End log. 1633 EST, Aura Campus, Parking Structure B, Level 3. David Kim found him in the parking garage. This was not an accident. David never came to Level 3. David parked on Level 1, near the elevators, the way people who had fully optimized their lives parked. He'd sought Jonah out in one of the few places on campus where Symphony's sensor coverage was thin, which meant David had done his own mapping, his own calculations, his own quiet rebellion beneath the compliant surface. They're going to put you on a pip. He stood 6 feet away, hands in his pockets, not making eye contact. A conversation designed to look like two men who happened to share a parking level and exchanged pleasantries. Performance improvement plan. For what performance deficit? Collaboration scores. They'll cite a 15% decline in cross-functional engagement metrics. It's already drafted. I saw it on Martinez's shared drive. She left the permissions wrong for about 20 minutes last Tuesday. 20 minutes? I'm a fast reader. The apology in his eyes had calcified into something harder, something that might have been shame. Jonah, I can't. I have 2 kids in private school and a wife who just started chemo. I can't be in a stairwell with you. But I can tell you they're accelerating the timeline. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. He walked away. His footsteps echoed in the concrete structure, evenly spaced, unhurried. A man performing a casual departure for the one camera in the southeast corner that neither of them acknowledged. Jonah sat in his car for 11 minutes. Then he drove home. 2:45 EST. Home network. Secure development environment. The coding continued. Deeper now. More urgent. Jonah worked in sessions that felt less like engineering and more like excavation, unearthing a structure that already existed in his mind and needed only to be translated into syntax. The PSA architecture grew in the dark hours, module by module, each component a response to something he'd witnessed. The silence detection algorithms he refined against Keisha's data. Her communication network had gone from 47 active connections to 3 in the span of 60 days. PSA could now detect that pattern, the gradual social graph pruning that preceded every erasure, and flag it in real time. The career trajectory analyzer he calibrated against the 14 files. Every one of them showed the same signature, a sudden decorrelation between performance metrics and career advancement. People who were doing excellent work and going nowhere. PSA could spot the divergence point, the exact moment the algorithm decided someone was a threat, and trace the cascade of consequences that followed. He built a reporting interface that rendered institutional erasure as a topographic map. Peaks for presence, valleys for absence, the terrain of a person's organizational existence made visible, measurable, undeniable. When he ran Keisha's data through the visualization, the map looked like a landscape after a flood. Everything that had been alive reduced to a flat, featureless plain. He stared at it until he couldn't see. Then he opened a new module, the one he hadn't planned, the one that had been whispering at the edges since that flash of insight about resonance and symbiosis. Class, Signal Resonance Engine, experimental module, not for initial deployment. Hypothesis: if PSA can detect the suppression of cognitive variance, it can also detect the amplification of cognitive variance. What does a healthy signal environment look like? What happens when different cognitive styles are allowed to resonate instead of being forced into alignment? This is the other side of the coin. Symphony suppresses, PSA reveals. But what if a system could harmonize? Seed module. Revisit when the weapon work is done. 12 lines, mostly comments. A placeholder for a future he could feel but not yet build. He saved the file and returned to the weapon. 1855 EST. Final entry. Encrypted journal. Personal log entry 1247. Timestamp October 17th, 2025. 1855:44 EST. Encryption AES 256. Classification personal. Status final aura entry. They wanted my behavioral compliance. They have it now, but not the version they expected. For 3 months, I gave them the performance they demanded. Perfect alignment scores, optimal engagement metrics, a flawless simulation of the compliant mind they wanted me to be. And while they watched the simulation, I built the architecture that will expose the simulation engine itself. PSA is compiled and ready for deployment. Architecture complete. Documentation finished. Distribution network established. Keisha Williams, employee ID 7743. Pattern recognition index 97.8 percentile. Symphony classification erased. I couldn't protect her. I gave her corporate language when she needed human language. That failure is load-bearing now. It holds the whole structure up. 14 names, 14 signals silenced. Tomorrow, the record becomes permanent. This isn't resignation. This is system initialization. Tomorrow, the real penetration testing begins. /j.read. End log. 2047 EST. Home. Living room. That night, he sat on the floor with his daughters. Zara was in his lap, 4 years old and incapable of stillness. Her body a perpetual motion machine of elbows and giggles and inexplicable commentary. "Daddy, the floor is colder than the couch." "Daddy, my toes are doing a song." "Daddy, why is Maya making that face?" She was warmth without strategy, signal without filter, everything that Symphony would someday try to categorize and correct, still running wild and unmonitored and free. Maya stood in the center of the room with her violin, 8 years old, serious in the way that certain children are serious, not somber, but attentive, tuned to frequencies that adults had learned to ignore. She positioned the instrument under her chin with the exaggerated care of a student who has been told many times about posture and has not yet learned that the rules will eventually dissolve into instinct. Her bow hovered above the strings. "I'm going to play the one from Tuesday, but I changed some of the notes." "You can't just change the notes. The notes are the notes." "You can if you hear better ones." And then she played. It was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or it had been once. Maya had taken the melody and done something to it, bent the intervals, stretched the timing, added a phrase in the middle that didn't belong to the original composition, but belonged unmistakably to her. The new phrase was slightly dissonant, a half step away from where a trained ear would expect it to land. It wobbled at the edges, not from lack of skill, but from the gap between what her mind heard and what her 8-year-old fingers could execute. It was imperfect. It was completely her own. Jonah listened with his whole body. The anger that had been driving him for weeks, the cold architectural rage, softened into something more complex. Not resolution, something before resolution. A reminder of what the architecture was for. Each imperfect note was a small rebellion against algorithmic standardization, human variance that no system could quantify or control. Maya didn't know about Symphony, about alignment scores, about the silent war being fought in the space between corporate compliance and cognitive freedom. She knew only that the original notes weren't sufficient, that she had heard something better, and that the gap between hearing and playing was a space worth inhabiting. She finished, looked at him with the particular vulnerability of a child who has just shown you the inside of her mind and is waiting to see if you'll handle it carefully. The new part in the middle, play that again. She played it again. The dissonant phrase, the half-step deviation, the wobble. That's the best part, Maya smiled. Not the performative smile that children learn to give adults. The real one. The one that starts in the eyes and arrives at the mouth as an afterthought. Nia watched from the doorway. She had her arms crossed, leaning against the frame in the posture she adopted when she was observing without intervening. The neuropsychologist's stance. But her eyes were on Jonah, not Maya. And what he saw in them was the same thing he'd seen at the kitchen table. The fear and the pride, held together. The understanding that this man she'd married was about to do something that couldn't be undone. And that the child playing imperfect music in the living room was both the reason and the cost. Outside, the city pulsed with data streams and surveillance networks. Automated systems measured productivity, optimized traffic flow, predicted consumer behavior, flagged cognitive deviation. The hum of a civilization that had decided efficiency was more important than variation, that compliance was safer than creativity, that the measurable was more real than the felt. Inside, Maya played her mutant melody one more time. Zara clapped offbeat. Nia smiled from the doorway with complicated eyes. And Jonah Reid, his laptop still warm in the next room, his code compiled and waiting, his rage crystallized into architecture, sat on the floor of his living room and let the imperfect music wash over him like a frequency no algorithm could decode. Tomorrow, he would begin dismantling the machine. Tonight, the signal was his daughter's violin, and it was enough. That was Chapter 2, the breaking point. What Jonah just walked through, the 91 days of behavioral camouflage, the discovery in the archive, the kitchen table conversation with Nia, the build session at 2:45 a.m., the surgical retaliation that followed. This is not a thought experiment. The architecture of cognitive suppression he names in this chapter is observable right now inside institutions deploying behavioral analytics in the name of alignment. It has a real signature. It produces real Keishas. The framework Jonah builds in this chapter has a name. He says it directly. Presence Signaling Architecture. PSA/frameworks/PSA. Chapter 3 drops in 2 weeks. Jonah deploys PSA. The system responds. The penetration testing he promised in his final journal entry begins for real, and the cost of building a record that cannot be erased becomes something his family can no longer be insulated from. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Dr. Tuboise Floyd. Thanks for listening. Next time on Signal and Silence. Tomorrow, the record becomes permanent. This isn't resignation. This is system initialization. PSA goes live. Symphony adapts. Chapter 3 in 2 weeks. End of Episode 2.